Alan Arkin, the legendary actor, passed away in 2023, leaving behind not only a cinematic legacy but also his longtime home in Carlsbad, California. The property was a modest yet striking Spanish-style house, sitting quietly on a sloping street lined with palm trees and weathered stucco walls. Unlike many Hollywood estates, it was not ostentatious. Arkin was known for valuing privacy and simplicity, but the house carried decades of his presence. Bookshelves overflowing, sunlit rooms filled with memories, and the faint smell of sea air drifting in through open windows. After his passing, the home stayed vacant for several months while probate matters were settled. Locals would sometimes pause at night when walking their dogs, noticing lights flickering inside though the house was locked, or hearing the faint sound of a piano, though neighbors swore no one had been inside since the estate sale. By the following year, the property was purchased by a young couple, Matthew and Claire, who had relocated from Los Angeles in search of quieter surroundings. They were drawn to the history of the place. The idea of living in a house once owned by a man whose films had touched so many lives carried a strange magnetism. The home seemed to welcome them at first, warm sunlight pouring through the arched windows, the charm of original tile floors, the comforting sound of ocean wind rattling the shutters at night. But soon after they moved in, small disturbances unsettled them. At first, it was ordinary things: misplaced objects, faint drafts in rooms with no open windows. Then came the less explainable moments. Claire waking in the night to hear low voices in the study. Matthew swearing he saw a man's silhouette pass in front of the kitchen window though the backyard was empty. Even their dog began refusing to enter the den, sitting at the doorway whining, as if something unseen lingered there. They learned from a neighbor that Alan Arkin had often used that den as his private retreat, a space where he would read, rehearse, or sit silently for hours. The couple grew uneasy, yet there was no malice in the atmosphere, more a sense of restlessness, as if the house itself had never truly let go of its former inhabitant. The longer they stayed, the more they felt watched. It wasn't an oppressive presence, but it was constant. The rooms carried a weight that wasn't entirely their own, and late at night, Claire admitted to Matthew that she sometimes heard someone whispering her name when the house was still. The first weeks in the Arkin house felt almost enchanted for Matthew and Claire. They unpacked slowly, savoring the process of arranging their lives inside rooms that felt weighted with history. Morning light entered through stained glass panes near the front door, splashing muted colors across the terracotta floor tiles. In the evenings, they would sit in the courtyard under the old olive tree, listening to the ocean wind stir the branches, and speak about how surreal it was to be living where Alan Arkin had once lived, laughed, and worked. It was more than a house to them. It was a fragment of Hollywood history, quietly tucked away from the noise of Los Angeles. Yet, there was something peculiar about the silence inside. The house was never truly quiet. Even when the windows were shut and the couple settled into bed, faint creaks wandered through the ceiling beams, and muted thuds sometimes rose from the far end of the hallway. They tried to explain it away. The structure was old, the wood expanded and contracted with temperature, but the pattern was too deliberate. The noises seemed to follow them, as if the house were aware of their movement, adjusting to their presence. The den became the first place to unsettle them. On the day they moved in, Claire had wandered into it, noting how strangely untouched it seemed compared to the rest of the property. The room carried a heaviness of air, as though no one had opened its windows for years. Dust clung to the corners despite the house being cleaned before the sale, and a faint, dry smell like paper left too long in the sun lingered. She decided to turn it into a reading nook, imagining shelves filled with their own books and a soft armchair by the window. But each time she tried to decorate it, something felt off. Pictures slid sideways on the wall within days of being hung. The air seemed cooler there, even on the warmest afternoons. Matthew noticed it too. He worked from home and often passed the den during the day. Sometimes, in that quick glance through the half-open door, he thought he saw movement inside just the corner of his vision, the vague impression of a shadow shifting. When he would look directly, there was nothing but the stillness of empty space, light bending across the floor in harmless stripes. Their dog, a gentle retriever named Oscar, confirmed their unease. Oscar, normally fearless and affectionate, refused to cross the threshold. He would pause at the doorway, his ears pinned back, and whimper if coaxed. Once, when Matthew carried him in, the dog trembled violently, twisting to leap back out into the hall, where he pressed himself against the wall and barked low, warningly, at the vacant room. Claire tried to dismiss it, but at night the house grew stranger. There were times she would wake and listen, certain she heard the faint scrape of a chair moving across the tile downstairs. Other times, she swore she could hear the quiet plinking of piano keys, not a melody, but hesitant, single notes pressed in the dark. She mentioned it to Matthew once, her voice almost embarrassed, but he didn't laugh. He admitted he too had heard it once while walking past the den late at night. The door nearly closed but not quite. A faint vibration in the air as if someone had just let go of a cord. It was during the third week that something heavier began to build. Claire had left her notebook on the dining table one evening, open to a page where she had been writing a list. When she returned the next morning, a line had been drawn through her handwriting, thin, deliberate, made by a hand that wasn't hers. The line wasn't a scrawl or a child's scratch, but perfectly straight, as though someone had carefully struck out her words. She stared at it for long minutes, unsure if she was losing her mind. When she asked Matthew, he denied touching it. The couple tried to laugh it off, even as they both grew quieter in the evenings, listening for the things they didn't want to acknowledge. But the house seemed to notice their unease, and soon its silences carried more weight than any sound. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. One night in late autumn, the quiet in the house deepened to the point of pressure, as if the walls themselves were drawing in a breath and holding it. The wind outside was calm, the streets still, yet inside, Matthew felt a heaviness that kept him from sleeping. He lay awake in their bedroom, watching the shifting patterns of moonlight play across the plaster ceiling. Claire stirred beside him, muttering in her sleep, her brow furrowed as though caught in some tense dream. Sometime past midnight, he heard it again, the faint piano notes. This time they were clearer than before, low and deliberate, as if someone were trying to piece together a melody from memory. Matthew sat up, straining his ears. The sound seemed to come from the den, winding up through the narrow staircase and along the hallway to their bedroom door. He glanced at Claire, but she didn't wake, so he rose carefully, pulling on a sweatshirt. The house was cold when he stepped out into the hall, the tiles freezing against his bare feet. Each step closer to the den brought the music into sharper focus. There was no rhythm, just a scatter of keys pressed with hesitation, as though testing whether the piano still lived after years of silence. When he reached the doorway, the sound stopped. The door, which they usually kept open, was almost closed now, only a narrow slice of darkness showing between the wood and the frame. Matthew froze. He could see no light inside, but he sensed something there, an occupied stillness, the feeling of a room aware of being watched. He didn't enter. Instead, he closed the door gently, trying not to make a sound, and returned to bed. The next morning, Claire noticed something peculiar. On the kitchen counter, where they often left stray mail, a single sheet of staff paper lay folded neatly in half. It was old, yellowed at the edges, with faint smudges of graphite that suggested notes had once been written on it but later erased. Neither of them owned staff paper. They hadn't brought it into the house. Matthew stared at it for a long time, his stomach tightening, but he said nothing. In the days that followed, the den grew more hostile to their presence. Claire decided she no longer wanted to turn it into a reading nook. She avoided it entirely, walking quickly past its door whenever she needed something from the other side of the house. Matthew, on the other hand, felt an odd pull toward it. He couldn't explain why, but sometimes when working in his upstairs office, he would pause mid-sentence and feel compelled to stand at the top of the stairs, listening, waiting for a sound he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The house began to mirror their unease. Lights flickered more often in the evenings, not the erratic blink of a bulb nearing its end, but sharp, single flicks on and off, as though someone had tapped the switch. Oscar grew more unsettled, too. At night, he would whine softly, pacing the length of the hall outside their bedroom, occasionally stopping to stare at the staircase as though expecting someone to ascend. Once, in the dead of night, He barked with such ferocity at the closed den door that Claire had to hold him back by his collar. What unsettled them most, however, was the sense of intention. These weren't random quirks of an old home. The erased sheet of music, the measured line across Claire's notes, the piano that played only when no one was there. Each occurrence felt deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to make itself known. It was Claire who broke first. One evening, after weeks of keeping her fears to herself, she confessed to Matthew that she had begun to hear whispers when she was alone in the house. They weren't distinct words, but hushed, urgent sounds, like someone speaking just behind her shoulder. Once, while folding laundry in their bedroom, she'd felt a brush of air across her cheek, warm and fleeting, as though a breath had passed beside her face. She turned quickly, but the room had been empty. Matthew didn't laugh. He admitted that he, too, had been waking in the night to find the den door ajar, though he had made sure it was closed before bed. He described the music he had heard more than once, and how, the previous night, he thought he had seen the faintest glow like a candle's flame through the crack of the den door. The house was no longer simply unsettling. It was intruding on their lives, inching closer each night, refusing to be ignored. The house had begun to dictate the rhythm of their days, quietly, invisibly, like an unseen hand turning the pages of their lives. What was once subtle background noise now pressed forward with unnerving persistence. The den, which they both avoided, seemed to exert a gravity of its own. Even with the door closed, Matthew often felt the air heavier near that end of the hall, as though stepping closer meant stepping into a different pressure, a different atmosphere entirely. It was late one afternoon when Claire lingered too long near the den. The sun was setting, casting long streaks of orange across the living room, and she had been gathering laundry to fold. She passed the door and, without thinking, rested her hand on the brass knob. The metal was icy, far colder than anything else in the house. She froze, feeling a prick of unease crawl over her skin. She told herself she would just open it a crack, reassure herself it was only an empty room. The door creaked softly as it swung inward. The den lay in shadow, though the window shades were open, letting in what remained of the day's light. The air was still, but layered with something she couldn't name, a density that seemed to press against her chest. She stepped only half a foot inside before she stopped, her eyes drawn to the far corner. There, on the old wooden desk they hadn't touched since moving in, a single pencil rolled slowly across the surface, turning on its side and coming to a rest. She had seen it happen, seen it move with no one near it. Her breath caught. She backed out quickly, closing the door with a trembling hand. That night she said nothing to Matthew, though she was pale at dinner and picked at her food without appetite. He noticed but didn't press. He had his own secret. 4 days he had been waking just before dawn, always at the same time, for 17 a.m. Each time, the silence was so absolute that he could hear his own heartbeat. And each time, just as he convinced himself it was nothing, he would hear the softest noise from downstairs, the scrape of a chair leg, the faint plunk of a piano key, or worse, a slow, dragging sound across the tile. He had never gone down to check. Something in him insisted it was better not to know. The house's disturbances began to creep into the daylight. Neighbors mentioned that the lights seemed to turn on and off at odd hours when the couple wasn't home. A delivery driver swore he heard someone speaking inside when he dropped off a package mid-morning. Though Matthew and Claire were both at work, even Oscar grew more agitated, scratching at the back door during the day, desperate to be let outside, then refusing to come back in until coaxed. One Sunday morning, the couple attempted to reclaim their space. They decided to clear out the den together, convinced that if they changed the energy of the room, perhaps the unease would fade. Armed with boxes and cleaning supplies, they entered side by side. At first it was ordinary dust, cobwebs, the faint smell of disuse. They opened drawers, stacked old papers, and tried to treat it like any other room. But the deeper they worked, the stranger it became. Inside one of the drawers, Claire found a notebook, slim and leather-bound, tucked beneath a scattering of receipts and yellowed letters. The pages inside were filled with writing, some legible, some hurried and nearly illegible. Notes, fragments of dialogue, character sketches. One page caught her eye. Scrawled in dark pencil, the words, "You are not alone," repeated several times across the paper. Each line written heavier than the last until the page nearly tore. She showed it to Matthew silently, her hands shaking. Before he could respond, the overhead light flickered violently. Once, twice, then out entirely. They stood frozen in the sudden dimness, the only light spilling in from the hallway. For a moment, there was silence absolute, suffocating silence. Then, from the far end of the den, came the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping slowly across the tile. Though neither of them had moved, they fled, abandoning their boxes and supplies, slamming the door shut behind them. Neither spoke of it for the rest of the day, but that night, the house seemed alive with whispers, drifting through the halls, seeping beneath their bedroom door. The breaking point came on a night when the coastal fog pressed thick against the windows, muffling the outside world until the house felt sealed within its own suffocating silence. Matthew and Claire had gone to bed early, both worn down from weeks of restless sleep, yet neither drifted into slumber. The weight of the den pressed on them even from across the house. It was close to midnight when the sound returned the piano, clearer than ever, no longer hesitant or searching. A melody unfolded, haunting and unfinished, each note drawn out as if from aching memory. Matthew sat up instantly. Claire clutched his arm, whispering for him not to go, but he shook his head. The fear had settled into him so deeply that it twisted into defiance. He could not let the house own them any longer. Together they crept downstairs, the floorboards beneath their feet groaning louder than usual, as though the house were aware of their movements. The den door stood ajar, a sliver of golden light spilling into the hall. Matthew exchanged a glance with Claire. Neither spoke. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the air felt different, charged, electric, heavy with the scent of something sharp and metallic, like ozone after lightning. The old upright piano, left in the corner since before they moved in, gleamed faintly though no light touched it directly. And there, seated at the bench, was the shape of a man. Not solid, not fully formed, but an outline that shimmered faintly against the darkness. Shoulders hunched, head bowed, hands moving across keys that pressed themselves, producing the mournful sound that filled the room. Claire gasped softly, her hand tightening around Matthew's. The figure stilled. Slowly, deliberately, it lifted its head. Though there were no distinct features, they felt unmistakably seen, as if the weight of a life once lived pressed against their own. A silence followed, so absolute it seemed to hum. Then, with one final chord that hung in the air longer than it should have, the figure dissolved, dissipating into nothingness. The den grew cold in its absence, and the piano stood silent, its keys untouched. On the desk, where they had left the leather notebook, a single page now lay open. Words scrawled across it in dark pencil. "I can't leave." Matthew closed the door that night, and neither of them ever entered the den again. They tried, at first, to pretend nothing had happened, but the truth seeped into their lives like the fog pressing through the windows. Whispered voices trailed them in empty rooms. Lights flicked on even after they had been unplugged. Oscar grew thinner, pacing the halls with wide, fearful eyes, until he refused to stay in the house at all. By spring, Matthew and Claire made their decision. They could no longer live within those walls. They packed their belongings quietly, leaving behind more than they took, unable to face the den one last time. The house was listed for sale once again, its history whispered only in cautious tones by the neighbors who had heard the strange music at night. To this day, the den remains closed. Realtors show the sunlit kitchen, the charming courtyard, the arched windows, but they hesitate at the end of the hall. Prospective buyers often pause, glancing at the door as though they can sense something waiting on the other side. And when night falls, those who linger too long outside on the street claim to hear the faint, sorrowful chords of a piano drifting from within, as if Arkin himself still lingers, unwilling to let go of the home where he once found solace. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.